Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Migrant Women of Color Rising. And today I am joined by the beautiful, absolutely wonderful Christine Mudavanhu-Makumbe. She is the principal and founder of Utano Consulting. She's an entrepreneur. She's a mom of a teenage son. And she's also a champion for change for migrant women of color. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you very much for having me, Annie. I appreciate you having me on your platform.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want us to just, dive into Christine, because there is so much to talk about today. And your journey is a little bit different from most of the women that I have interviewed so far in terms of your coming to Australia. But before we speak about that, I just want to let everyone know how I came across you and your work. So I came across Christine having attended one of the summits that she convenes, which is the Migrant Women in Business over in Queensland. And she's been doing an incredible job in terms of discussing issues that pertain to migrant women, in particular to do with skills that are not being utilized by the government there, and skills that are needed but are not being utilized. And she's gone on to do a number of other summits, and they are done monthly. The last one that I attended was it last month or earlier this month?
We did them on the last day, on the 30th of each month, with the exception of February, obviously.
Yes. So the last one I really, really loved, which was about, Chimananda. And I keep forgetting this. Why do I keep doing this, Christine?
The danger of a single story.
Yes, the danger of a single story. And you had quite a diverse panel of really outstanding women talking about their journey, and just really sharing their stories. And they were so, we really connected and resonated with what they had to say. So I just wanted to set the scene for those who are watching to know who I am talking to and why, and how you and I met. So Christine, why don't you take us back to what led you to come here in the first place, to Australia, and how that journey was in terms of settling in to Australia?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Annie. I think my journey for me starts from the age of 5. I was one of those kids who grew up in a very small town outside of the capital of Zimbabwe, Harare. I grew up in a town called Chegutu, which for those who are familiar with Rhodesian times, it was called Hartley. Very small farming community. And so in our community, we basically, there was less than, 5 or 10,000 people that were in that community. It was mostly farmers. And I always had a vision and a passion for the greater world and what was my place in it. So I was always leaving Chegutu. I was never one of those kids who was going to stay. I didn't want to go to Harare. Harare seemed too small. I wanted to see what the big wide world had to offer for me. So throughout my junior school life and my senior school life, I was always looking and trying to discover where my place would be in the world. But I knew I wouldn't know that for sure until obviously I had ventured out into the world and managed to look at different places. So I think that's where my journey really begins for me. I got married at a very early age, in my early 20s, and the person I married had a similar vision to myself. Well, they had to have, because that's all I talked about ever since I met them, that we're not staying here, we're leaving.
Yeah.
And so they knew that from the get-go. And that, I think that was the reason we were attracted to one another, because we had this vision and this passion for seeing the world and what our place in the world could look like. Yes. And so basically, we got the opportunity at a young age because of our wonderful friends who were overseas themselves at a time and had kind of left Zimbabwe in a very different capacity to everybody that I knew at the time. So everybody that I knew had either left and gone down the nursing pathway to the UK, which is what most people did. They went back to the mothership. And most people left, they kind of found a job and they did odds and ends, and that never kind of attracted me because, you know, it was kind of looking and thinking of my vision in the medical world. I just could not see myself doing that. There are people who've got those skills. I don't have those skills. So then the opportunity came for us to leave, largely, like I said, through my friends who were expatriates in the oil industry. And so they supported us to have a different vision of what living overseas could look like. And so we left the country, and we left. At the time, we had really, really good jobs in Zimbabwe. So we had savings, and we were a young couple. We had no kids. We had no responsibility. So although we were married really young, because Madam was on a mission to leave, we were not having any children. So we left. And when we were married, we had been saving pretty hard for our overseas move. So we had already saved quite a bit of money, which helped us to settle. And what also helped us to settle is we moved to New Zealand at the time. I got a job pretty much in my profession straight away, working for Wellington City Council as a business analyst, because my background was accounting. I had done training through what was Coopers and Lybrand, and then that later to be PricewaterhouseCoopers. But in Zimbabwe, that became Ernst & Young instead of, because they didn't take part in the global merger. So when we got to New Zealand, I think we got to New Zealand in October, and I had to check my CV for this. I did start working in November, just before Christmas. So for me, I think it was 8 weeks or 6 or 8 weeks. And I got a job. So I was pretty lucky. Now, I know that it's not everybody's story. I know that. But that was my story. And so for then, that set my path. So I had a very stable job. My then husband went to school to do his master's degree. We moved out of our friend's house that we were staying at. We stayed with them for a pretty long time because they didn't care. They just wanted us to be stable. And then we moved into obviously our own space, and we started on our journey. What was interesting at the time was my husband had the papers for Australia. We were actually coming to Australia. We were only going there to see our friends. We weren't actually planning on staying in New Zealand. We actually just hadn't told them. We're like, we're coming. We're like, nah, New Zealand's tiny. You know, we want to go to Australia. But when we got there, we sort of did okay, well, let's see if I can get a job. Because at that time, Zimbabwe was still part of the Commonwealth. And so getting into New Zealand, and we're talking 2001, it was just after September the 11th. Because I remember we traveled, 9/11 was in September, and then we traveled October. So it was just after.
That is close, yeah.
And so because I remember distinctly, I was serving, it was the last week of my notice at my job in Zimbabwe when the Twin Towers came. So I remember that very distinctly, and I was serving my notice to leave the country, and we didn't realize how different travel would be at that time. So then when I got a job in New Zealand, because it was like, and the thing is though, it was like, okay, well, let's see if I can get a job, we'll make a different decision. That's kind of how it went. So there was a friend of ours, a mutual friend of the ones that we were staying with, who was actually working at a recruitment agency. And so he said to me, bring your CV along. So I took my CV to him, and then he sent it around to some people, and I got a job. And so I was on a work permit. And then because I had a work permit, then that meant we could apply for a spousal work permit for him. And so we just kind of then started our journey. And I think within 2 years, we had permanent residency. It wasn't even 3 years. We were eligible to apply for citizenship. It was actually, our migration pathway was really very, very easy. and simple. So I am so grateful for that, because I know that's not a lot of people's story.
Yes, and that's why I wanted you to paint that picture for us, Christine, because for majority of us, it hasn't been that simple. It has come here and, start from the bottom and kind of work your way up, and it hasn't been easy at all. And there are those who have come, not just as migrants, but have come under, a refugee status as well, and having to, navigate life in that way. Before we get into coming into Australia itself and getting into your career here, corporate career, let's talk about your growing up in Zimbabwe. What are your memories like as a child?
I loved my childhood. I had a very happy childhood. I cannot, complain. Every time I think of my childhood, it's full of memories, it's full of fun, it's full of laughter. I come from a big family. I'm the last girl of 5 girls. I've got 2 brothers. I've got a younger brother. He's younger than me, but he thinks he's older than me. And so we had a lot of fun growing up. Had very supportive parents. My mom was home most of the time. She managed to raise us. She would work with my dad. We were, just an average middle class family. My dad owned the local butcher. And because we went to the local school that the white farmer kids went to, we were friends with the farmers' kids growing up. So that little school, although I was in a minority, I didn't realize it at the time that I had such a positive experience in my very early childhood of being in a minority. I was one of a handful of Black children at the time that were in this predominantly white school. But because we were young, it wasn't an issue. And because we were like the first years that was starting, I think there was grade 1, 2, and 3 when I started in that school. So we were really tiny, and we were very protected and very nurtured in that environment, because the school grew a grade every single year. And, and the majority of kids walking through the door were white kids. As you know, segregation comes in different forms. It can come in the old apartheid form, where they tell you that as a Black person, because of the color of your skin, you belong here, or it can come in the form of economics, And so my dad, although he had quite limited education himself, firmly believed that his children should have the best education that he could afford. So my parents didn't spend money on luxury cars. They didn't spend money on massive houses. We had a pretty nice small house where we lived. My parents drove very average cars, but every single cent that they made went into our education. So we went to the best schools that Zimbabwe offered at the time, because my dad firmly believed that in order to give us the opportunities that he had never had, we needed to have the best education. And at the time, the best education came in the form of the former colonial master schools, if that makes sense, because they just simply moved out of the public schools and created their own schools, and you create the economic divide. So I did have the fortunate upbringing of having been private school educated in both junior school and senior school. Senior school was a little bit more of a rude awakening around the color of my skin, because there was a lot more awareness at that time. There was a lot more people who wanted to make you more aware that you were Black, and therefore wanted to make you feel less than. But because I had come from that environment where I was 7 years, I was in a minority, and these guys were my friends, I never felt less than. I didn't care. I just thought, well, you're a nasty person, you're not my friend. And so I've managed to maintain a lot of those skills, and I didn't realize that until a friend of mine once said to me, why does it not bother you? Or they said it quite candidly. They said, why are you so comfortable around white people? And I said, well, why wouldn't you be comfortable? They're just people, And I realized that all throughout my life, it's not that my color wasn't an issue. I just never saw it as a barrier to entry in any place, because from a very early age, I had been raised and nurtured in an environment that reaffirmed for me that I belonged in any space, and it didn't matter what I looked like. And if somebody was mean to me, they were just a mean person.
Right. Wow. And So how does that then play out when you move to Australia? Because a lot of people coming here, you're coming from a country where you are part of the majority. You're not really thinking of yourself any less than until you come to a place where it's different. You are a minority. You are, finding yourself being treated slightly different. For you, how was your experience given how it was growing up and the exposure you already had in regards to how life was in Zimbabwe?
I think for me, if I contrast New Zealand and Australia, the experiences were quite different for me. Now, New Zealand being a smaller country, obviously you have a smaller population base, but I felt it was a lot more cosmopolitan than Queensland, a lot. And the racism there is not as in your face as it is in Queensland. It really isn't. We were able to be in neighborhoods and places, and you didn't really feel it as much as you do here. And so I had quite a different experience in New Zealand. In New Zealand, my child was fine. He was, again, probably the only Black kid at his school. And for me, I didn't feel anything wrong with that because that's how I had grown up. So for me, it was like, you know what, it's just life, just get on with it. It just happens to be the environment that you're in. And besides, you're overseas, you can't expect to be in a majority anyway. And for me, because growing up, that's how I had grown up, and that's how my child was growing up, it wasn't foreign to me. So it wasn't something that I was actively questioning.
Yes.
Or actively even preparing my child in a very conscious way that, look, you're going into this environment, you're going to be like, I just wasn't doing that. Maybe I should have been because of some of the things I had to deal with later, but it just wasn't at the forefront of my mind. All I was looking for is what is the best school for my child? This is it. Zip, going. And that was the decision-making process. When I moved to Queensland, what was interesting was the kids were really nasty to my son. And I distinctly remember an incident when he was in year 2, because we moved here when he was pretty young. He was 6 at the time. And so I remember picking him up from school, and my kid's quite chirpy. He's, the social butterfly and very carefree, happy-go-lucky kid. I picked him up, and his whole demeanor was kind of like hunched over and down. I'm like, sweetie, what's wrong? And he's like, Mum, this kid was washing me. And I said, what kid? And so apparently there was this young girl in his class who took him to a tap and was washing him. And because they were trying to wash the brown off.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a hard story to talk to about. And he's like, why would she do that? Why would she say that? I'm African. And so my kid had always grown up knowing he was African. He'd been to Zimbabwe 2 or 3 times already at that time. So he had a strong sense of identity of who he was. He wasn't struggling with it. And now this child was questioning a 6-year-old. Wow. And so that's when my journey with overt and covert racism really, really began. Although I'd experienced it in Zimbabwe, I'd experienced it in a different sphere. And it's very different when you're experiencing it through the lens of your child.
Oh, yes.
And so he struggled, on and off throughout different schools, because as you can imagine, we are in a minority. And if you're going to send your kid to schools in certain neighborhoods, your child will be in the minority. If the neighborhood is not multicultural, the school is not multicultural. Yeah. And like I said to you before, because of the lens I grew up under, multiculturalism wasn't a factor that I was necessarily looking for in the school environment. I was looking at, okay, what are your statistics? What are your grades? What's your ATAS? What's your OP score? What are your teachers? What do the reviews say about you? What do fellow parents say about you? So I was looking at the character of the school. I was looking at, I was also looking at the alumni of the school, because a lot of the things that I learned at a very early age was that your networks matter. And I think that's not something that we're taught a lot in Zimbabwe, at least growing up, not explicitly in that way. But what I learned, because I went to a farm school, and so by the time a lot of people were leaving that school, particularly the children who didn't go on the academic pathway to do what was your GCSE A-levels at the time, which was the Cambridge system that I studied under, they already had jobs when they left. They didn't have to apply for jobs, because they worked for their friends' dad's farms, or they had this network of people that were offering them jobs. So that was one thing that I did learn. And I learned that sometimes your grades don't really matter, because some of these kids who already had jobs were like struggling in school, and you're like, how'd you do that? You know, and that's when you realize you're like, okay, so the network does matter. So I knew that. So that was also something that I was looking for. I was like, okay, so, you know, there's old boys networks, and you find that when people, or old girls networks, when people come to school, there were parents who would come and talk about their backgrounds, about their experiences and things like that. They would come to career schools. So all that stuff matters. And you being here as well, you would know that your network matters. So those were the kinds of things that I was looking for here. And my niece, I also had my sister's 2 children that I migrated with at various points, that migrated after I was here, that came to live with me. When my niece, the one who moved to Australia with me, because I left the other one in New Zealand because she met her boyfriend who became her husband then. And so Auntie became less important. So she kind of gave me a backstory about how she loved me. And so I left her there very reluctantly, but I was, you know, wanting to move with all my kids. But my niece that I moved with here to QUT, she kind of had a very different experience here, because she came at 13, you know, and that was really hard for her, because you can imagine transitioning, leaving your parents behind, you're coming to stay with your aunt who, let's be honest, when you last saw her, you or stayed in an environment with her, you were really, really young. And although, you know, you've talked to her on the phone, you're still 13, you know. And so essentially she came into our house and became another child in the house. And, you know, she's 13, you know, growing up, you know, raising her and all of that involved. But, you know, you find when I talk to her reflectively now, she struggled a lot when she got to Queensland, because she learned in New Zealand for a short period of time. Then we moved here. But my niece, but their experience in New Zealand of racism is very, very different to Queensland. And so Queensland has a lot of work to do. In its fabric, in its history, in its society. It has a lot of work to do in terms of recognition around race. And that's a lot of what's fueled the work that I started out here, which really started out more as a passion to say, well, I have a voice, because I'll keep talking until somebody listens, even if you ignore me. I'll find a different way to raise my voice. It's just who I am as a person. But, you know, talking to other women, talking particularly to young students through the university experience that I was going through with my niece, I found that there was a real big gap in that mentoring, that support for people of color. And so I started, I joined QUT Careers and Mentoring Advisor. I was the only Black person there.
Tell us what QUT is for those who do not know.
QUT, Queensland University of Technology. So they market themselves as the university for the real world. So that was the university that my niece was in at the time. So that was our university. So I was there all the time because she was there. And so through, you know, sort of vicariously mentoring her friends, she suggested, well, Auntie, do you want to be part of this? So she sent me her careers and mentoring, and I went there indirectly to support her. That's kind of how it all started. And then I teamed up with a beautiful lady called Diane McCluskey, who's now at UQ, who ran the QUT Careers and Mentoring program. And Diane just indulged my passion for bringing executives, for bringing people into the university environment to talk to migrant students. to give the heads up on how do you enter the workplace, how do you present yourself, what can you do in a university space that can enhance your CV, that it's not just about getting the degree. I used to host these sessions that were called Hour of Power at QUT, and what I would do is I'd get 3 or 4 CEOs, and they would come and talk to students.
Wow.
And we mostly tried to keep the students. Initially, it was just African students, and then we opened it up to other students as well. Sometimes when the African students didn't, interestingly enough, rush to take up the seats that were there, that was the other thing. Even though you were doing this work that was targeted and aimed at them, they didn't always take up the opportunity to do it. So I ended up having, Caucasian kids, all sorts of kids, at these lunchtime sessions. And I'm sitting there mind-boggling. I'm like, a chief executive is giving up 90 minutes of their time during their very busy day. These are the people who want to employ you. Make the time. And that's one thing that I do have to say is lacking in our community. I don't know about the Kenyan community, but while we might understand on a logical level that education is important, what we haven't understood is that networking is even more important, because this is where you meet the people that are going to give you a job, and the importance of mentoring and actually embracing every opportunity. Because I think that's one of the things that's really helped me, is at every opportunity I've looked for who is where I want to be, and how do I get hold of that person so that they can teach me. I mean, they already know how to get there, right? And most people who know how to get there will teach you if you ask them.
Yes, I think that is something that growing up myself as well, in Kenya, mentors were not a thing. It was not a thing. It was your parents, your aunties, your uncles. Those are the people that you looked up to. But the whole mentoring thing, I think, has come as we've left home and been exposed to places where we don't know people. We are not connected in that way. And then so seeking to know somebody who's doing what you would like to do and wondering how can you get connected to them, because these are people who can potentially open doors for you in your future. So I think from that perspective of, coming from a place where you are sort of connected and people, moving to a different place and not knowing how to navigate that. Christine, I appreciate that you've shared so much about setting up, coming here, your kids, your niece, and all that, and the barriers that you faced as a family. I'd like to talk to the issue of limiting beliefs. Self-limiting beliefs, because for me as a life coach, I work with migrant women of color to help them to unshackle their self-limiting beliefs so that they can live a life of purpose and impact. I listened to your story, and you come across as this really confident, articulate, strong Black woman. Do you have self-limiting beliefs, Christine?
Oh, of course I do. You should hear my bathroom talk. If you put a megaphone on some of the things I'm saying to myself, it's kind of like, whoa.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were going to say?
I guess it's just share with us, what are some of the things that come up for you, and how do you silence those voices, those things that kind of try and get in the way? How do you deal with that?
I think for me, the biggest thing that I'm grateful to the industry of multi-level marketing, because I did that for a very short period of time. Wasn't very successful, fell flat on my face. But the one thing that I learned from that industry was personal development, and the importance of investing in developing yourself, the importance of positive self-talk, the importance of really having a conversation with yourself in the mirror. I learned that just after I landed in New Zealand, I'd always had the entrepreneur bug in me. And so pretty early on in New Zealand, a couple of people approached me about joining a multi-level marketing. I didn't know what multi-level marketing was. I hadn't heard of it. And I just thought I was just selling stuff. I didn't realize I'd have to recruit the whole world to sell with me. And all of that stuff, I didn't get enough. I didn't do enough research. I didn't get enough information. So I irritated a lot of my friends at the time, trying to get them on this thing that I was so super excited about. But what was interesting about being in that environment for the short time that I was in was how positive these people were. And they had this massive positive outlook on life. And they were always talking about, you can do this. And not only were they talking about it, they were playing music. You would go to these mini conventions and there'd be music pumping up. Every week we had a book to read. So I love to read anyway, but I wouldn't say I'm your ferocious reader. Like, I'm not on Oprah's level, not by any stretch. But reading, growing up in Zimbabwe, to get an education, we understood you have to read. So you learn to cultivate a passion for reading from an early age. It's not optional. And I had done English literature at A level. I had studied English. So reading was part of my nation, but I wasn't reading personal development books until that time. So that for me is actually what really, really helped me. That industry introduced me to the importance of developing self. And so I've just continued on that pathway. I'm a massive fan of Brene Brown. I'm a massive fan of Tom Bilyeu. I'm a massive fan of Gary Vee. The list is absolutely endless. And, and these are the people and these are the voices that are in my head. Lisa Nichols, Steve Harvey, all of the people who have done absolutely phenomenal things, There's a friend of mine who does a talk show where she interviews amazing women from Zimbabwe. She interviewed one of my Zimbabwean idol women. Her name is Nancy, and she used to be the CEO of Unilever. Now, if you know how big Unilever is, and yes, and so she is one person whose career I have ferociously followed, because she said something to me. She said, in that interview, which has stuck with me, and I loved her attitude. She said, given all the opportunities I was given every opportunity to succeed, which I was too. I had no excuse to fail.
Wow.
And so I loved what she said. So when I apply it to my life, my father, my parents, my mother, they sacrificed a lot for me to have the kind of education that I had, for me to have the life that I had, for my brothers and sisters and I to be able to have this worldly outlook. My dad, who had barely a year 7 education, put in his life's soul to make sure I had the best, right? And that not only that I had the best, but I never felt, growing up in other African families, you feel responsible for raising your siblings, right? A lot of us get that responsibility transferred onto us early. I'm at the end of the pack, so I didn't have that. Other people were responsible for me.
Yes, I get that, because I'm the last born as well, so I was everyone's responsibility.
So my success, everybody's responsibility. So not only did I have the support of my parents, I had the support of my sisters, and so that gives you a very firm ground to take a lot of risks, because there's an army of people that if you fail will pick you up, and I have failed. I tell you stories about that, and they will pick you up and they will polish you up, and you can go back out there. So I think when you also have that confident a base, the risks that you're able to take are greater, because there's certain things you're not as worried about, because I know, I know that if my life goes belly up and completely explodes on me, which it can do, which it kind of has sometimes, I have people who will drop everything to put it back together, not just in my immediate family, but in my friends' circle as well. And that gives you tremendous courage to try new things. It doesn't mean that you're not having negative self-talk. It just means you then can go through a rational conversation with yourself about the worst case scenario. And when the worst does happen, because like everybody else, I've been on this planet for 40 odd years. And so I've had tragedy in my life. I've had so many, I've had my world fall apart, and those people have come through and they have picked me up. So it's not theoretical that I know that they'll be there. It's also been reinforced by the fact that when I needed them, they were there. So that, I think, gives me the fuel to do a lot of the things that I do in the way that I do it.
Wow, that is beautiful, Christine. I want us to get into Botano Consulting, because I really want you to share about the work that you're doing with your company. I know it's fairly new, but please talk to Utano Consulting. What is it? What are you aspiring to do? And so that people can get an understanding of your area of expertise.
So my background is strategy and policy, which I got into by complete accident. I applied for a job in New Zealand, and I went to the job interview, and I had an accounting background, like I mentioned earlier. And so I thought it was a business analyst accounting job. No, it was a policy business analyst. I had no idea what policy was, like zero. So I got interviewed, and interestingly, I'll never forget this woman, Leanne. She was the HR manager. Because I went home and I was like, oh, that was an interesting interview. I have no idea what they talked about. So they're never going to call me back. So they called me back the next day. So I went to this interview. It was the most bizarre set of circumstances. And I'm looking, and now I'm worried, because I'm thinking, did I lie on my CV? Because I definitely don't know. So I got into this interview because she had said, look, we want you to come back. Our CEO wants to meet you. And I'm thinking, your CEO wants to meet me? I don't even know what this job requires.
Wow.
Sitting there, and the CEO's there, the HR manager's there, one of the managers I was going to end up reporting to, the team that I ended up in, was there, and another manager was there. So there was this whole panel of people that were there to interview, in my mind, the most unqualified candidate. Did you? And so and then the HR manager goes, no, we have your CV. We know you don't have a policy background. We're very much aware of that. And I'm like, oh, phew, so I can relax now. We're just going to have a conversation, And I was thinking maybe they want to offer me something else or whatever, because it was quite a simple role. And so I said, they talked to me. They said, look, we had a conversation and we really, really like you, and we want to offer you the job. I was like, huh? You want to offer me a job? I'm qualified for it.
That is incredible, Christine. Wow.
So they offered me the job, but they, on the condition that I obviously study and I learn. And so I said, well, does that mean you're downgrading the pay or the job? They said, no. You applied for the job at that level, at that pay. That's what you get it. And I was like, okay. Are you prepared to work with us? So that's how my journey into the public policy and strategy started. So I did my master's in strategy and policy. And so I then started doing consulting work in New Zealand around the strategy and policy space. So I already had a consulting bed by the time I got to Australia. But when you're in a new country, to do consulting, you need a network. And I had a network in New Zealand. I'd lived there for 10 years, but I didn't have a network in Queensland, and I needed stability. So I went back into the public sector and I built my network that way. So I built my network by doing a whole variety of different jobs. And so I was trying to marry my work in the community development space around, championing the cause of marginalized groups, particularly women, migrant women, particularly myself. And I thought, well, the workplace is the place that I think can make the most difference to everybody and anybody. So if you can economically empower a person, then you strategically, culturally, and socially empower them too. Because guess who gets listened to? Guess who gets given the opportunities, right? I don't see a lot of people being given poor people being given opportunities. People who are economically empowered get to have voice to a lot of issues.
Powerful. Yes.
So that's when I became really passionate about what do I do in this space. So I started learning a bit about, so I started doing support for small business. So saying to women, okay, because skills recognition was a massive issue. And so I started saying to women, okay, if skills recognition is a massive issue and you can't get your skills recognized, well, business is another way, right? Let's hone in on entrepreneurial skills and let's use that. So that's kind of how Utano started, offering a small business program with the Islamic Women of Australia's Association. That got funded by the Salmon Foundation, it got funded by the Queensland government. And because I knew and understood how to write grants, how to write funding applications, because I'd been in the policy space, I was able to maneuver that environment. And because I also had the networks, because my policy work tied me into the not-for-profit sector, I was able to then leverage that in my work and do some really good work in that space. But then I realized for me, my passion was still corporate. And so my passion was really, why are there no women of color that are leading and running these multi-million-dollar organizations? Why is it when you go around the boardroom table, look at any statistic in Australia about leadership, and middle to lower management, lots of diversity. Upper management, especially executive management, where decisions are being made that are actually impacting the trajectory of people's lives, there's limited diversity. And for me, that's not healthy. And so the best way that I thought I could influence that was by pivoting Utano Consulting to be really focused on organizational performance and peak performance, to be focused on creating psychologically safe organizations where people feel included. Because when difference is included, that's when productivity happens. But not to have a soft, fluffy company, but really to have things like, measurable analytical tools that a CFO can link tangible changes to their KPIs. So that's why I use Conductor software in my business, because then you can actually then link the interventions that you put in to your KPIs and see that the needle is moving. So organizations that are serious, that are really wanting to put in the investment and the time, want the data to be able to do that. And so that's what we do now. We work with organizations around they're creating inclusive and psychologically safe workplaces, not only for their staff, but for their executives as well. We do unconscious bias training. So that's really about looking at how do you as an organization, as a leader, actually, how is your unconscious bias influencing leadership decisions in a way that you're unconscious about, that might be creating So it's really not about, finger pointing or any of that. It's really about raising people's conscious levels to their unconsciousness. Like both you and I have unconscious bias, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, that's the issue. And as a leader, the first step is to acknowledge I've got unconscious bias. The second step is, how do I make it conscious? Once it's conscious, I can do something about it.
Absolutely. Let's inclusive leadership is something that you're really passionate about. Tell us, what is inclusive leadership and how can this be incorporated in the corporate sector where you're working with the leaders that you're working with? Talk to that, please.
So inclusive leaders, in my view, are leaders that actively seek people who have contrary views to themselves. Because if you're a leader and all you want to do is hear from people who say yes, no to you, you end up in the position of like our friend, in the US election, where when people tell you no, you don't even want to hear no, So for me, an inclusive leader is somebody who is actively seeking out the very best out there that are there to challenge their ideas. Because if you're the smartest person in the room all the time, you're in the wrong room. You need to get into a different room.
Oh, that's powerful. Yes.
So the leaders I work with are leaders who want to get into a room where they are the least smartest person in that room. Because then, as a leader, you grow, you expand. Your point of reference is different. And that's where the magic happens for organizations. So I work with organizations, and the organizations I seek are not organizations that I have to convince. They're organizations who are already on the path of saying, I want to do better, of saying on the path that status quo is not good enough. So how do we push the envelope? And you push the envelope by pushing yourself first and foremost. And if you can push yourself, then you open up, right? And that's not an easy thing to do. So with the psychological safety, you've got to create a safe environment for leaders to feel that, you are non-threatening coming into them. People might, and this is not placating people or anything. That's not, and I know some people will think, oh God, you want to be kissing up and no, that's not what that's about. That's not what psychological safety is about. If anything, that is a very psychologically unsafe environment because it's not being honest. So what it is about creating an environment where people can show up honestly as themselves, respectfully as themselves. And we can get to points where we agree to disagree, but it is done with respect. I feel heard, I feel listened to, I feel understood. You may not have taken my advice, that's perfectly fine, but you've given me the platform to be able to air a different point of view to you. That's inclusive leadership.
Oh, wow. I love how you've described that, which leads really nicely into the next question around the monthly summits that you've been convening, that you've been hosting. Let's talk a little bit about that. And I'm very conscious of the time now. But if you can just briefly talk to us about where the intention, with this summits has come from and what you're hoping to achieve, because the few that I've attended so far have been so impactful, and I can't wait. I've registered for all the rest as far as it could let me go. And I'm so ready to attend them, and I love that they're virtual, that you can attend from absolutely anywhere, and just the accessibility of it. So where did the idea come from, and what's the intention with this?
Well, the idea of a virtual summit came from COVID. That wasn't my idea. COVID kind of forced me into that. The original idea was we were going to have a conference at the beginning of the year in April. And that conference came from my years of work of looking at, I want to elevate the voice of migrant women. I want to elevate the voice of those women that are in corporate, those women that are running businesses, those women that are actually doing the work, but just you never hear from them. And there's so many of them. I want to show the world that we look different. Migrant women are not a charity case. That was really my fueling passion. It's that we are a force to be reckoned with. And the first one, I think I can't remember if you attended, but the first one, Deloitte and Touche talked about the research.
Oh, yes, I attended that. Yeah.
So my conversation about this event really started with Natasha Doherty, understanding her research at that time, because Minister Fentiman had said to me, look, if you can get Deloitte interested in doing a conference, count me in. I will support you. So I had to convince Deloitte because they had research, because we didn't want to have a willy-nilly conversation. We wanted to have a conversation, and I'm a researcher as well. So I wanted to have a conversation based around facts, like what is the opportunity cost? Well, 250 million to the to the Queensland economy, to the Queensland economy. And so that's a number. That's a lot of money, 49 out of 100 migrants are not working in their profession. Oh. We can do something about that. And so we now have hard evidence and hard data as a state. And so that was what the central conversation was going to be about, which was we have hard evidence here that we are underutilizing the potential that is already here. We keep importing new potential with skilled migrants, but out of every 100 that we're importing, we're not using 49.
Wow.
That's really half.
Absolutely shocking.
So that makes no sense. So it was a case of getting industry aware, and also getting industry aware that, your myths around what the average migrant here that's struggling to get a job looks like are completely false. Because the average migrant is a 35-year-old commerce student who most likely has some sort of business major degree, either an honors or a master's degree. Very different. Most of them, if not all of them, have been through some sort of English language test, or they have to learn English language competency. So if you've come here under the skilled migrant category, or you apply under that category, or even apply for residency under that category. I'm not talking about the humanitarian visa, but the skilled migrant pathway. You have to do an IELTS test.
Yeah.
And I challenge anyone who's done, my son does Australian English, like really, and compare that to what you're expecting people for whom English is a second language to pass. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So for me, it was let's start to have candid conversations about what the barriers are. Let's challenge the mindsets. Let's blow some of these stereotypical myths about migrants, which are not true. They, like Chinamanda says, it's not that a stereotype isn't true. It's that it's not the only story. So that's why she says it's the date of the single story.
Oh, yeah. And I think you, with your last summit, I think you really did well in dispelling, that myth. What are some of the biggest issues holding back migrants from thriving in their new countries? And I know it's different from person to person, but from your lived experience, what are you seeing as some of the issues that are really holding back from migrants really thriving? Because there's no denying they are skilled. They are highly educated. What is holding them back from thriving?
Part of it is opportunity. Another part of it is mindset. You asked a lot about that. The other one is it's very different doing business here. A lot of us come from primary production countries, and this is something we don't talk about. This is something we'll talk about at one of the summits next year. Business looks different here. We are more in a tertiary service economy that's, really, really mature in terms of product offerings and things like that. Whereas at home, you could open a store, right? And you would have a ton of customers that are coming to you to purchase the goods and items that you need. And a lot of the goods and items that you need are actually physical products that you are selling to people. People that need it. And so your access to market and your costs of accessing the market were a lot lower, and you also understood the market.
Yes.
So a lot of us don't have those skills. And so you don't have the confidence to then, how do you launch your product? How do you get into the marketplace? How do you even intervene in the supply chain? So this is some of the conversations I'm having with bigger organizations is how do you open up your supply chain to the migrant community? Because that's where things are going to make a difference. So say, for example, you are a Commonwealth Bank, for example, your supply chain is humongous, right? If you have an ethical supply framework that it dictates your procurement policies, and say, for example, like I'll give the Aboriginal example, governments all around Australia, 3% of their procurement should go to an Indigenous organization. That is part of the Indigenous procurement framework. That's what I'm talking about. You don't necessarily have to have a quota, but you can have an ethos to say, can we actively seek businesses from people from marginalized backgrounds as to be part of our supply chain? And then with your supply chain, educate yourself. How do you re-engineer your barriers to entry? I am a boutique consulting firm. I cannot compete on the same level as your pitcher partner. I cannot compete as Deloitte. Do you know what I mean? Like that's a completely different. And if your supply chain is only ever going to be open to your Deloittes, your pitcher partners, your, that consultancy, there's a space for that. But there's a space for Utano within your supply chain. How do you open up your supply chain? And I think if we can start to have meaningful conversations, and the corporate sector keeps asking me, how can you help? Open up your supply chain. Open up your supply chain in a way that is actually supportive. And also understand that you've also got to walk on a journey. Because some of these companies are not used to producing things to a level that is required for a certain type of industry. Be committed to be on that journey. Be committed to hosting workshops to help those suppliers level up, basically. Because people want to learn how to do that. You cannot expect people to go from 0 to 100. Firstly, they don't have the resources, right? And secondly, they need you to get the resources. And so if you are truly committed to change, Put your money where your mouth is. You know how you know when people are committed to change? Watch where their money is.
How they're spending.
Exactly. I've had conversations with people. A lot of people ring my organization up. You know, we want to do this. We want to do inclusive leadership. We want to do that. We want to do this. Yeah, I have these conversations, you know, nice Zoom meetings, and I never hear from them. And I follow up with some of them, but a lot of the times it's just nice to blow hot air that, you know, we want to be inclusive. We want to make a difference. You know, maybe I'll host a charity. Oh, Christine, you know, and I'm like, I don't do charity. I'm not a charity. And so, you know, when you're trying to explain to people that is one of the biggest barriers, is the view and the stereotypical view that people have when the word migrant is attached to something. Is that, oh, you know, we're talking to people that are struggling. We're talking to people that are this. We're talking to people that are that. There's an element of truth in that story, but that is not the whole story of the migrant community. And if you keep narrating that single story, that is what Chinamandes talks about when she talks about the danger of a single story. You need to look at the holistic view. Open up your supply chain. Put your money where your mouth is. Actually invest in what an inclusive workplace looks like. Invest in it over time. You're not going to deal with your bias by attending one of my workshops. You actually have to invest in a series over time, because you're going to get staff turnover. You're going to get, you know, attrition. You also need people, you're asking people to change a whole way of thinking that was framed by their childhood and what society has told them. You know, like right now, the world is adjusting to having a vice president that's a Black woman in America, like the echoes that's sending in America in and of itself. And her husband has to reframe a position that has only been held by women in its entirety. That's going to take time. You cannot expect that Doug will get it right on the first time. You cannot even expect that the second time. But over time, you start to invest in all of that. And I think that for me is what's missing, is that commitment to invest in the long term, because that's where change is going to happen. It took a long time for us to get here. It's not, I don't have a magic wand. I would love to tell you that I have. I'd love to tell you that I have a brilliant program, which if you send your board to, you know, just like that, you're going to have an inclusive environment, all good. I don't have that.
Yeah. At least we want that the work that we're doing, we want it to have an impact in that our children will not have to go through what we've had to go through to get to where we are. But there's things are becoming a little bit easier, a little bit evened out. You know, there's some form of equity along the way, certainly for migrants, and more so migrants of color. Just finishing off, Christine, what advice would you have for a migrant of color who is watching, feeling stuck about how they can thrive, particularly those who are in corporate structures? You know, it is the feeling stuck, the feeling of not being seen, not being heard, or perhaps even having a seat at the table, but being so grateful that you are actually at the table and not contributing effectively. What advice do you have to that particular person?
So firstly, I think you need to understand that you absolutely belong at that table. And I think that's where it all starts. It starts from you. So when I'm sitting at a board table, I'm not looking around to see who's there and who isn't there. I'm there and I belong there. So I think it starts with you as a person, knowing and owning the space that you're in. Once you have that and you have that confidence in yourself, then the rest is easy, because then you're just executing the belief that you have in yourself. Then you're not walking into a meeting room and keeping quiet. You are walking into a meeting room, and whether they like you or not is irrelevant. You are going to contribute your ideas. You take away that ingrained. I remember once a person said to me, you should be grateful to be, they said to me, oh, I bet you're really grateful to be here. I said, where? Here? Why? Here is in what? Australia? And they're like, yeah, you know, you must be, you're from Zimbabwe. You're really grateful to be here. I said, why? I'm slumming it here. You know, this person just was, they didn't know what to say. I said, why? I'm slumming it here. And they said, what do you mean you're slumming it here? I said, I'm slumming. Do you know what my life in Zimbabwe could be like right now? Said, let me educate you. I would not be suffering cleaning my own house, for starters. I'd have someone to drive my car. I would have someone to pick up my kid from school. And I would be running a massive empire on my own. And they just looked at me and they said, why are you here? I said, I'm having an overseas experience. What makes you think that, I should have this massive gratitude? Well, for your education. I said, the bulk of my education was done in Zimbabwe.
Wow, that's true.
And so it really, it took I was able to respond in a genuine way because I'm genuinely secure in who I am. Mm-hmm. I don't feel this indebted gratitude to the Western world for giving me my sense of identity. My sense of identity and purpose came from my parents. It comes from the people who love me. It comes from the ethos and the background and the long chain of powerful, strong women from Zimbabwe that I come from. That's who I am. So I am not indebted to Australia for anything. Australia is here to offer opportunities to everyone. I'm here to find the opportunities for me, but the opportunities that work within my ethos and what I'm trying to achieve. So this business that as migrants, we feel indebted or emboldened to hear needs to start with us saying no. Hang on here. We are people that come from great places. Our nations have great stories to tell. The fact that your schools choose not to teach them does not necessarily mean they don't exist. In fact, they do exist. It's just that you guys are too ignorant to look outside of yourselves and then take the opportunity to educate them about our gorgeous continent. And the fact that we're 54 different countries, we're not one homogenous continent. The fact that we come from greatness. And yes, our leaders mess up, but hang on, the leaders here are messing up too,
and everywhere else as well, as the world is watching. I love how you brought that to a close in terms of knowing who you are and where you come from and embracing that. I love what you're doing, Christine. I love the work that Utano Consulting is getting into, that DEI space, that inclusiveness, certainly trying to create safer, psychologically safer environments in our corporate spaces, because that's where we spend most of our time for those who are in, professional careers and so on. But the work that you're doing is really necessary. And the summits that you are hosting have been really game-changing, life-changing, and very much needed. So mine is to say thank you so much, but also to ask you, where can we find more of you? For those of us who have watched and gone like, I need more Christine, I need to know more, I need to follow her, I need to stalk her. Where can we find you? Tell us some of the places we can find you.
Well, I'm on all social media, so you can find me personally under Christine Mudavanhu-Makumbe on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram. You can also then find my company, Utano Consulting, on LinkedIn and on our website is utanoconsulting.com. If you're interested in the summits and you're interested in getting involved in that conversation, because we need more women to occupy that stage, the website is www.qldmwibsummit.com.au, and you can email us at qldmwibsummit@gmail.com as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we will have those details underneath here so that people can be able to access that when we create a blog for this wonderful conversation that we have done. Now, if you're watching this and you had been mentioned about self-limiting beliefs, I have a free mindset audio guide. It is 3 steps to help you unshackle your limiting beliefs. So head over to upliftingstudios.com.au and you'll be able to download that. Now, thank you so much for joining us. Christine has been an absolutely amazing. You are You're on fire. You are on fire, girl. And I can't wait to see where, your journey goes from here, into 2021 with the summits that you're doing with Utano Consulting and a lot more, because there's no doubt you've been made for greatness.
Oh, thank you. That is, I take that compliment. Thank you so much. That means a lot, Annie, coming from a fellow woman who I've just gotten to know and following your work, and truly back at you, girl, because I love everything that you represent and everything that you're doing, and creating this platform. It's so, so needed, and you're doing it so, so exceptionally well.
Thank you, Christine. See you, everybody.
Bye.